All right. It's such a fun time, right? Okay. All right. Okay, away we go. Need a catchphrase for the start. We don't have a catchphrase. All right. Actually, we do, but we'll get to that. Because I haven't introduced the course yet. I'll do that at some point. There are some introductory slides. And we'll see how well I'm hewing to those claims about what we're doing. I'm trying to get this out of my mask here. All right, so let's see. So a couple of things. I've just tuned up this stuff, right? The stories list. It's going to be automated at some point, but it's just sort of. So now going forward, which is good. We'll just, I have this kind of grab bag of videos from. Oh no, disaster. The coffee. I mean, this is the beautiful material. No, okay. It's all right. Okay. Okay. So I'm pro caffeine, of course. Let's see. So you'll have if you want to go to slides, there'll be little clips and things from the past, and I'll kind of change those as I go along in life. But this is sort of the plan going ahead. Is through your course, you'll just have a direct copy of whatever wonderful things were presented to you in real time. So I think that's of great value. Anyway, so I'm trying to organize myself a bit better there. All right, so there's one thing. Okay, so the things. Oh, we have office hours at 4 today. That's all online. So we had one yesterday. It was very good. Oh, I put the slides. I'll put the notes up for that. Yes. Put notes up. It's my fault. Okay. All right. Just a couple of things about where we are with COVID, which is such a fun thing. So various, I've shown you The Economist and the Fun, and you will have looked at your own things. There's World Info Meters. Anyone ever look at that one? You ever seen that one? I think they've made a lot of money they were one of the first ones to get it together. It's kind of a mess, but it's advertising. And for a while, they were actually they still remain a pretty good source of just getting straight to it. They do a reasonable job. It's worldometers.info, which is one of the questionable domain things. Anyway, yeah, so you can mess around with all this good stuff. But of course, some of these big outfits, New York Times, Economist, Financial Times have made some compelling visualizations. They've far out exceeded what anyone has done in academia or for the government or anything like that. It's really been the press that's done a good job of trying to kind of organize this and make sense of it. So this is the US. And as we know, this data, this is cases. The data back here is just terrible, right? So this is really underreported. Even the deaths are underreported because it's just problematic to know what happened early on. But as we've talked about, excess deaths helps clarify that, but we might never know because it just depends what's on the death certificate. And that's something that's just impossible to revisit, basically. And providing your country has a good way of reporting deaths. Africa, we don't have a lot of information about. China, of course, is problematic. Russia, of course, had really low counts early on, but, they're one of the worst. This is going about as fast as it can, so you can, is that all right? Yeah, it's good. Okay. Usually there's like a band over here, and it's kind of a sidekick, but, there's not as much money. So I don't even get a fan these days, so that's a bit of a shame. We used to have a musical episode. That was good. All right, so test this is whatever, but this is kind of the main things: hospitalizations, and these lag, right? These typically lag from cases if we're recording those well, and deaths are still, moving along in this direction. But we would expect them. I'll just update it. We would expect this to, roll over as long as this continues to roll over. What's unclear is, this is where we were last year through summer. That's the winter. It's unclear what will happen here. It's just very unclear. There's the huge difference is vaccines exist in this period of time, right? They just exist in the world. Pretty unevenly distributed around the world. Some places not at all. Some places rather completely. And then we've bumped into the limits. The U.S. is now, in terms of the major countries, I think, behind in terms of overall vaccination, even though it did a great job early on. Really did a good job, but then it stopped. So I guess I want to point those things out. Anyway, this is a little bit of this. Always looks a little more stressful than it possibly is. Uh, okay, I just changed the thing. Yeah.
It looked on their chart like that hospital over there had 95% ICU occupancy, even though.
This one.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know. I actually don't know. Yeah.
And they had different colors for the dots.
Yeah.
So maybe they're taking people from other states or something, because that didn't seem to go with the Vermont COVID incidents.
So measurement is hard, and I don't know. I can't tell you. I can't tell you. Yeah. So it looks like there's 95% by some one of these kind of reportings. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, the huge difference, of course, is vaccines. If we didn't have them, it'd be more like the 1918 pandemic, which was bad in the first winter and then much worse in the next winter. And summer was okay. What else do I want to show you in here? I suppose, it's always the per 100,000 you want to look at. I think I want to look at states. So Florida has not been doing well recently. This is deaths. In Florida, those numbers are going up. And this is all time. Yes. So this is, I guess I wanted to show this as well. So New York was the worst hit. The New York City area, right, going into New Jersey and Connecticut and New York State was the worst hit place in the world, right? And certainly by per capita remains that the spike there was just extraordinary. We have lots of personally, I have a lot of connections. I have friends who are doctors there. It was just horrific. And all the stories. But for a long time, it's really been New Jersey and New York, and New York's been ahead. Of course, it's because of New York City. But just recently, this has happened. That Mississippi has, this is reported deaths by COVID, reported deaths, which is another, it's not everything. So that's a bleak transition. These states are at the bottom of many socioeconomic indices. This is not a great thing. There's always going to be some ranking, of course, but it's given. Early on we knew what was happening in Italy. We knew what was happening in other places, so we could have responded. But here we are. All right. So I want to also tell you that it is a conspiracy. I'll tell you this. The whole thing is a conspiracy. I'm being a little obnoxious when I say that, but let me get the right thing. Yes. So I have some slides for COVID. So it's a conspiracy, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Did I say this already? Okay, good. My friends used to call me repeater, so that's good. I haven't done that. So it's a conspiracy. It is a conspiracy. I'm telling you, it's a conspiracy. It's a bleak thing. I'm trying to be funny, but it's. Does anyone know the origins of this word? Yeah. So the spit is the breathing, the talking, right? So conspiracy is right, is you talking, right? That's what that is. But this is inspiration and expiration, right? This is fundamentally about breathing. So it's not a real contagion, because contagion is to touch. And that's what the great peril early on was we just didn't know, right? The world was hot lava. Turns out it's just people are hot lava, right? The game is people is hot lava. So that's why we're wearing the funny things. But for a while it was, everyone was putting Lysol all over themselves and the cat and the car and everything. It was pretty good for the Lysol business, I guess, because we didn't know. And there are definitely things that do transmit like that. And so that was the version of it. But this is, to breathe, essentially, right? So it is breathing. And we did really, I guess scientists understood this, and I think some in the general public did. There was a story early on. I think it was a choir in Seattle or in Washington State where there's maybe 60 people practicing for 3 hours. There's a lot of breath, right? Singing. And I think from one person, they got to maybe 59 or 60 infected, right? That's boom. And that's not from spittle and all these things. And that's why, people would just have a face guard but no mask, because we were worried about this. And we did a great disservice to ourselves by, not really saying this early on, even though we knew it, right? So WHO and CDC only following them only said this in May 2021. It's just astonishing. That was an astonishing disservice to ourselves. So I don't. That's inexplicable to me. Yes.
Can I ask when you made that tarot card? Is that before COVID?
So you'll see stuff in this from after the work that we built after SARS, 2003 and 4. So this is from, the work is from 18 years ago, and it builds on stuff from 100 years ago. And this is, 5 years ago. Yeah. So look, I mean, I would sit in this course and say, these things will come, and we can't predict them, and we can't predict the course of them, and then just sort of walk out the door. It's not great. It's not great. But it's the socio-virus coupled system that becomes the big problem. Because we become the willing soldiers, unwilling and willing soldiers, right? We're the ones who become the photocopying machines. Yeah.
They're talking about Southern hospitals, but they've got an orange dot.
It could be a device. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So, I made that one a long time ago. Yeah. It's one of those things we don't have we don't really have, maybe back 1,000 years, but before that, it becomes kind of just stories about what happened. We have no idea how many people died. There are, they're sort of woven into people's folklore and histories. So a long time ago. So it's nothing that's happened is surprising to me. It's shocking and awful, but nothing is surprising, and it's been painful to be useless. Although we really did help Vermont because we got the right modeling people involved. It was good. That was good. Okay, so I'm going to get through the end of this part. Maybe we'll start on some. So this is about power law size distributions. Crucial thing. Again, we're talking about heavy tail distributions. They can have different forms, but we're going to focus on power law size distributions. This is x to the minus gamma. There are mechanisms that give rise to it, and that's a huge thing, right? We're going to be. I'll basically give you some examples of really interesting, powerful, real mechanisms that give rise to these phenomena. The statistics of surprise, which, terrible thing to worry about. So just to connect to some other stuff, and I had this floating around. So Pareto, you might hear it talk, Pareto distributions. These are power law size distributions. Again, naming it after someone, terrible idea. But this was a kind of getting into it, and you'll have this in your course later on, like 80-20 rule. Right? It's sort of a thing. We say it. People use this everywhere. Like 90-10, they'll say 90% of the work is the last 10% of the product. It's useful to kind of have that in your head, but it's obviously there's all these other divisions along the way, and this is really somehow connecting to some skewed distribution, and it's just one point on it. So this is, very similar to what we just had for the example that you worked with quintiles, right? So this is 80% of the wealth is owned by 20% of the people. This is late 1800s Italy. Yeah. So sometimes called that. You'll hear that in economics. Whenever I heard the dismal science term, I always thought it was because it was people, pejoratively saying that economics is terrible. Economists don't say that because they think it's awesome, but it's I think it was more about its bleak predictions of things. I will put this up. This is from the Black Swan. Do people know this book? Do you know this term? Like it's floating around. And so you know this book. Do you know this term? Does anyone ever say this? Okay, there was this. All right, so maybe I can delete it. What's that? No, the Black Swan. Do you ever? It's a Black Swan event. So that seems something that. It's an old term, maybe the 1800s in England. It was to indicate that something was very unlikely, right? So swans, white swans, they're white swans. And the idea was, and I guess they could have said, chartreuse or something, but the idea was we have white swans, there are no other colored white swans. So this event that happened in front of us is equivalent of that. Now, people, right? So he's made a whole story out of this. This is Taleb, who is famously a very obnoxious human, made a lot of money on Wall Street, um, and tends to block people on Twitter and talk about deadlifting for some reason. Anyway, so it's all a bit sad, but you know, what he's had is an influential story, right? People do talk about this. They have companies based around trying to find a black swan every 3 minutes, which is, you know, kind of not how the thing should work if you're finding a lot of black swans. This little example is, you know, it's hard to predict the future. This is a turkey who's doing pretty well. There's someone gives them lots of food. It's a terrific situation. They don't have to do much, maybe watch TV. They're not very smart, right, these turkeys. And then they become part of Thanksgiving, right? So that's his little humorous example for history not being a good guide for the future. All right, so, but the black swan idea, of course, has this big story, which is when Europeans turned up in what is Western Australia, they found black swans. They were just black swans. They're just black swans. So you can buy black swan lager. It's a big emblem of Western Australia. So I actually think it's kind of a terrible example because this is not a surprising thing. I mean, it's still a swan. The inside's a swan. It's a swan. It makes swan noises. They're rude things, you know, but it's just different color. It's not like a platypus is the big event. That's the thing where you think, God, I don't know what's going on. And of course, the Europeans brought platypuses back. I don't know if you know this, like, and they would present them, you know, the Royal Society, people with pith helmets on and so on, right? And and jodhpurs and things, and showing these things they'd found from around the world. What a time! Anyway, because of Brexit, the whole thing is gone, I suppose. But someone brought a platypus back, as I understand it, and they're like, no, you sewed this thing together, obviously, because so did Jenkins, right? Because this is sort of a thing. They would sew things together and try to claim they found a chimera of some sort, you know, in some far off land. But no, it's all stuck together, actually. The thing is actually stuck together. But that's a surprising animal, right? Anyway, so I'm just going to criticize the whole thing. But he has this sort of framing, and maybe just, I've left it in here because you're working on this in the assignment. It has some pieces that just to sort of see that you can connect to these power law size distributions, right? So for a normal distribution or any kind of nice finite variance distribution, you know, if you sample from it, the normal member is sort of mediocre, right? They're in the middle. They're nothing. They're within the lump. And then depending on the exponent, and we've talked about this now, right? So that -2 to -3 is this big break for the exponent. And then that's where you go from having a finite variance at exponent is down at 3, so -3, finite variance. And then if it goes more shallow, now we have an infinite variance and a finite mean between 2 and 3. So that's a place where we have, you know, potentially very big things can happen and so on. But as it pops above 2, as that slope in that log space becomes more shallow, then we get to this thing where the examples are always large. Infinite mean, finite mean. And then just this is a different kind of world. And I mean, of course, we see this sort of borne out financially. We see it with organisms, right? I mean, you know, ants make up some huge percentage of the biomass in the Amazon. They're champions. There are lots of nematodes. Of course, humans are running around, you know, being lots of us as well. And of course, you know, Facebook is gigantic, right? We worry about this, right? We have this idea that monopolies in capitalist societies are not exactly great, but they, yeah. And then, you know, I'll show you this in the next few slides. When we observe for a long time, you know what's happening, right? If you're sampling from a normal distribution, it starts to fill in. You're like, okay, this is pretty good. Nothing crazy is going to happen. And that connects with prediction. And then, yeah, all these pieces. All right, so it's not an unreasonable framing, and just to put it within a power law size distribution thing, it's okay. All right, so some of these nasty little pieces. So we'll have some more calculations in here. I guess it's assignment 3. I don't know why there's a beepy thing. Oh. Yes, I will destroy you. Bye-bye. Microsoft. So nice. Okay.
I think that was slot.
Was it Slack? I was watching some show the other day, and it had like a cell phone ring that was from the 2000s or whatever. It was kind of a PTSD thing because everyone had the same, and you're just like, no. Okay, let's go Slack. I don't know why I have that set up. I try to turn all things off. Okay, except for admin. I love your emails. He said directly into the camera. All right. They usually have cameras in the corner. You can't see them. So, okay, what are we doing? This is the average, right? So this is the average beast that we get out. We sort of have A and B, I suppose, in the assignment. But this is the business. We're going to call it X max and X min. And then, so this is the story that the mean blows up. This is the mean, right? We're just computing the mean. The mean blows up if gamma is less than 2. So gamma has to be greater than 1 for normalization. So 1 gamma 2, it blows up. And then it'll depend on the lower cutoff. This X min once the slope goes down, right? So gamma is greater than 2. And again, we've defined as this negative gamma, right? So gamma increasing means on a log-log plot that the slope is going down. There's less tail, right? There's less room in the tail. So typical sample is large, and we'll see in the first of these 4 or 5 mechanisms I'm going to show you, we'll have an example of this where the typical sample is infinite, which is insane, right? That's very strange. And it's infinite if X max is infinite. It's very large if there's a bound on the thing. Okay. So you've got this, you're working through this. All the moments only depend on the cutoffs, the endpoints, right? A and B in the assignment, X min, X max here. And typically there's some sort of mess in a real one, and then there's some nice power law, and then there's some cutoff at the end, right? Because of limits. But there's no internal scale in here that pops out and features in some measures of this. These measures that we're interested in, like the mean, the variance, higher order moments, there's no internal scale. Whereas just for a normal distribution, mu and sigma, they're sitting there in its structure, right? That's what you have. Okay. And so this is the interesting case for a lot of real distributions that we worry about, should we say. We're worried about these ones that are between 2 and 3. So the mean is finite, and the variance is infinite in the sense that it depends on the upper cutoff. And if we're in a situation where there's where the upper limit is infinity itself, then the variance truly is infinite. So this is a strange intermediate place where many of your samples aren't too big. You're going along, you're sampling from this thing, and then now and then you'll get something very big. Wait for even longer, you get something much bigger. So it keeps growing, and I'll have some examples of that. And so the sort of classic example to think about is sampling from the US. Let's sample from the US, take a random person, teleport them here, they're very confused, and measure how tall they are, right? So, right, and then we start to plot this in. We send them back. We start to plot them, plot these distributions, and you'll get a sort of a Gaussian thing for heights, right? No one is 100 feet tall or 1,000 feet tall or 10,000 feet tall. But if you ask them how much wealth they have, and their accountant tells you the truth about the Cayman Islands or whatever, so then you'll have some variation, right? So some people are going to say, nothing, I'm bankrupt, and then you're going to be all, debt is complicated for sure. But, now very, very rarely you pull out Elon Musk or Bill Gates. It depends on the day, I suppose, but that's pretty rare. Now we're talking about, Bill Gates, 1 in 300 million. And of course, we've talked about how wealth is so concentrated, but there are orders and orders of magnitude difference. So now we have a very different kind of thing. So most of the time when we're sampling from something like wealth, for example, people don't have a lot of wealth. You're seeing, okay, this country doesn't have, people don't have a lot of money here, but you keep going, and maybe the 1,000th, after 1,000 samples, you've got a millionaire. After 10,000, there's someone with, multiple millions, and you're like, and it keeps getting bigger. So, and if gamma is greater than 3, right? So again, this is now on the log plot, gamma is, we're pushing it down. So gamma is greater than 3, so it's steeper, there's less tail. Then it's not as bad, right? The variance is now limited. We don't have this big excursion, potentially. So the mean and the variance are both finite, but those higher order moments will at some point will be infinite. But these start to get confused with other things, right? They're now it's like the tail is just, it's not that far. People are so desperate to find power law size distributions that they will do it. So there's a mistake that goes in the other way. I'm trying to tell you these are a big deal, these distributions, and they're real and they're everywhere. Some people over the last 30, 40 years got a little excited about that and found them everywhere, because that's what humans do, right? So not everything is a power law size distribution. I mentioned this, I think, in office hours. Standard deviation is a lovely thing. It's a nice mathematical convenience. Variance has some really good properties. You can add variances together to get the variance of the sum of random variables. So that's great. So it's a real draw for it. But maybe this is what you want, actually. You want the average distance from the mean. This is the mean. What's the average if you sample from this distribution? How far are you from the mean? This is a very direct question, right? Like, how far do you expect to be from the mean? Fair enough. And if it's a thin, like a really peak distribution, it's not going to be very far. If it's a nice wide one, it starts to get out. And then what we have with these power law size distributions is it can be really enormous. It can be absolutely enormous. So if you do measure this, and you can't do it analytically, so that's why we sort of just don't use it, even though this is what you really want to use straight away. And in fact, for these, for between 2 and 3, this gamma where the variance is infinite, this is actually finite. So this isn't quite as explosive. It's all right. That's okay. Right. So this MAD thing, this what do I call it? Mean average deviation is just not good analytically. You can't do it. So we'll still talk about this infinite width spread if gamma is less than 3. And it's always, infinite in quotes, right? Because it could be, there's an upper limit. All right. Okay, so a couple of other things. These are assignments. These are from later on. I'll sprinkle some of these through the course. These are probably not true. But so here's an interesting thing. Let's say we have take n samples from our power law size distribution. You want to think about how to do that. That's a good problem. How do you sample from a distribution? We'll get to that. So you take n samples and you say, what's the size of the largest one? All right, so you can imagine doing this computationally. It'd be quite easy. If you had a little sampler, you say, I want 1,000, excuse me. It produces a vector of 1,000 numbers, and then you just take the max. And then you put that in a box over here and say, okay. And then you do it all again. You take another 1,000 samples and find the max again of that. So we're doing 2 steps, right? So you've got some distribution. You sample from it, sample, you get all these numbers. They pop into some bin. So n samples. Right, so we just we reach into this box in a sense, and then we find the max. And we'll call this x1. And then we repeat the whole thing. Right, so we erase this list. We take another n samples, find the largest one, and we collect our set of largest ones. So we'll have x1. So this x1, we'll call that, say, 1 from the sample. From the first run, this is x1, x2, x1, this is terrible notation, 3, maybe I'll put that. And then we look at that set of numbers, right? So so this is like saying, let's have 1,000 years of floods. What's the largest flood? Let's have another 1,000 years of floods. What's the largest year of largest flood? Do it again, do it again, do it again. And then what's the distribution of these largest floods that could happen every 1,000 years? And what you find with these power law size distributions is that, and there's a whole beautiful body of work here, is that the largest one is typically on the order of this. This is the number of samples you've taken, 1 over gamma minus 1. So 1 over gamma minus 1 is an interesting beast. So we had these kind of examples like gamma equals 2. So this is x1. We'll just say like this. It's going like this. Gamma equals 2. Then it's going like n. Gamma equals 3. And then x1 is going like n to the half. So these are these, I'm sort of focusing on 2 and 3 because they're these sort of really critical points for these exponents. This is where we go from having a finite mean to an infinite mean, finite variance to an infinite variance. And in between is this dangerous space of a finite mean and an infinite variance, which is really the statistics of surprise. Like, not that big, not that big, not that big. Boom. Okay. And so this, if you right, so we have a 1,000-year flood, 1,000-year flood, 1,000-year, it's actually, and then we think about 10,000 years or 100,000 years or a million years, then the size of the largest one is actually growing like the number of samples. And this one is growing more slowly, but it's still increasing. And if you look at something like a Gaussian, it will increase. So a Gaussian, you might have something, right? So again, we're going to sample from this Gaussian. We're never going to get very far out here, right? This is many sigmas out here, 10 sigmas. This is 1 in gazillion possibilities. So that x1 tends to grow more like some sort of log of n. I'll put this. It could be log n of log. There's some really crazy things. This is slow, so very slow. And this is what I'm saying here, right? So finite variance distributions, it's going to be a much slower growth. So something like this, for example, this exponential distribution doing the same thing, it would only grow like log n. So it's very, very limited, very, nothing worrying about. Log is very, very slow, slower than any power. So this is this example where, based on what you've seen before, it's not a good indicator of what's to come. And so here are just a couple, so these are kind of fun things to build, and you'll have a problem to do that. You have to think about a couple of levels. This is for 5 halves, so 2.5. So this is right in the middle. This is a case where, for an infinite range, we have an infinite variance and a finite mean. So 2.5. We're going to have 1,000 samples. So we're just going to sample, right? Just like this. So this is just the sample stage, right? This is just this stage here. Just the sample stage. So these are our floods. Let's say we're sampling. We get 1 flood every year for 1,000 years. What's our flood for this year? And this is 200 years in. We get this one that's pretty big, and so this is pretty surprising. This one is a shocker, right? Compared to what's happened before. Most of these are starting to look pretty small. This one is the same again, but it's now we're taking, instead of 10 samples, we're taking 100 samples, right? So this is, each one is the maximum of 100 samples. I didn't say that properly. Yeah, each one is the maximum of 100 samples. Samples of samples is the problem. Yeah. So still this kind of shape, you run it again, this spike could be here, it doesn't have to be as big, it's pretty rough, but you'll tend to see a lot of smaller things. This is just increasing out. Now we've got 1,000 samples, and we take the largest one of the 1,000 samples, and we repeat that. So 1,000 samples, what's the largest one? 1,000 samples, what's the largest one? Da, 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 da. And it turns out, in this case, we got a really big spike here. And these have just been dwarfed by that one. So you're going along in the world, and this is the biggest thing that's ever happened now. This one is, and now this one is, this is a linear scale. Log scale would inflate everything, but a linear scale, so it sort of shows you this is now 10,000, so it's just the same kind of thing. And what maybe is harder to see is that this is growing all the time, right? This axis is growing all the time. 10 to the 5 samples per, right? Each one is, there's 10 to the 5 here, 10 to the 6, in this case, 10 to the 6, 10 to the 6. Okay. So this is now the same thing, but gamma equals 3 halves. So that's now in this much more perilous situation where the mean is very, very either incredibly large or infinite, depending on what you're working with. And so you see these big, now you see much more dwarfs, right? It really goes, we're not seeing these little guys in here. And this is just for 10 samples. 10 samples take the biggest one. 100 samples take the biggest one. So you're starting to see these really big shocks. So most of the time, not too bad, but really huge when they take off. I mean, these are now 10 to the 17, 10 to the 15. These are big things in here as well. They're just, yeah. So a log scale would help you with that. So these are these two here. This is 5 halves and 2/3. This is the number of samples from which we then get our maximum, right? So log 10, so we take 10, take the maximum, 100, take the maximum, 1,000,000, take the maximum. And this is it would be for 5 halves, it's 1 over 5 halves minus 1, which is 1 over 3 halves, so it's 2/3. So the slope, this is a slope of 2/3. These are little distributions for these maxima, right? So that it's pretty spread out. Something like that tail goes right up there, goes past. So this is not a regression fit, but it's just to show you it fits pretty well. And then this is the 3 halves case. This is a slope of 2, which is, so now it's increasing with the number of samples quadratically. So this is really taking off. This is it's on a log scale, so you can't see it really, but these are the fits, 2/3, 2, pretty good. So this is, real peril in these things, right? There's real shock comes from sampling or experiencing these things over and over. I know I've said this, but I think in the way these kinds of phenomena are talked about, it's really sort of the flood example is a good one. That's kind of all forest fires or natural disasters, right? This is, it used to be we had this kind of flood every 100 years. Now we have it every 5 years, right? That kind of language is meaningful, and it's connected more deeply into this. Exciting. Okay, so that's another little thing. Right. Okay, so let me scoot along. So that's just about these PDFs, this heavy tail distributions. Now we're going to go back to the CCDF, which I introduced a little bit before, and then we talked about some examples. I'm going to connect it to Zipf's law. Zipf's law is this very famous way of talking about it. Yes? The degrading of a system?
Yeah, because what you said at the end there, we're seeing these floods every 5 years.
Yeah.
Before it was probably not like this. So we're seeing this sort of degrading in a sense of it's no longer holding to the sun.
Yeah, if there are these statistics underneath it, they've changed, right? It's moved like that. Yeah, so there are lots of other ways for things to fall apart, right? So it could be more in that. And there's like critical slowing down from it. There are lots of other different ways that things can explode. So if it's a degrading system, yeah, it could be a dynamic path for which it's just, so it could be where here's our sort of distributions of sizes. It didn't change really for 1,000 years. Now there's a real shift because of X, and now we're in a different phase. But if it's a gradual thing, the wheels are coming off, that could be just a different mechanism. And we do have this idea of like boundaries to cross in systems. We don't do a great job, but I think in ecological systems, we kind of try to talk about that. There's like, here are all these boundaries, like we cross the CO2 thing this way, or this one, which is a totally different thing, then we're in a lot of trouble, right? That's good thinking, but.
What do we call that P would be bigger than particle symbol?
So, yeah, so this is the complementary cumulative distribution function. A lot of words, yeah. But we'll just say CCDF. So the CDF is normally, that's a common thing. But that's the cumulative distribution function, which is, what's the probability that something is less than some value. So it's just the integral from minus infinity to x kind of thing. And that's this piece here, right? So in principle, these are connected. Depends on whether you have, for real data, it can be messy. But this is what we're doing. We're just integrating from x to infinity. All right, so let's just put this in. We'll just put a proportional sign, x to minus gamma. So if we do this integral, yes, we get minus gamma plus 1 on the bottom. We're going to say infinity is the upper limit, so that's going to go away. We've got a dummy variable of x prime. And so this is I didn't quite have this before, but this is the upshot of this, is we say, okay, well, this was a clever thing to do, basically. Let's look at this complementary cumulative distribution, because every time when we do this integral, it's going to be just about the tail, right? It doesn't matter what comes before it. Before it can be all sorts of messed up stuff, but if we've got a pretty good tail, then, and it really does go out like a power law, then we have this nice result, which is that the complementary cumulative distribution function is also a power law. Its exponent is minus gamma plus 1, so if you wanted to put it in that, it's minus gamma minus 1. So if we started with a 3, now it's 2. That would be the better way to put this. But what's also happened is, because it's integration, it smooths things out, right? So differentiation smashes things apart, makes it gets sharper. Integration smooths it out. So for each point x here, you're using all this data about what's above x, right? So it's putting a lot more. There's a lot more information goes into this. So it cleans up the data. People have used this a lot for actually measuring the exponents. And we had this before. Here's the PDF for the Brown corpus. And the CCDF is this nice, clean structure to it. You measure the exponent here, and then that will give you the exponent of the underlying distribution if you add 1 to it, right? So the CCDF has some exponent. Let's say it's 2. Then we add 1 to it. We'll get the exponent of the PDF, what's really going on underneath. Okay, so you see that a lot in the literature. It's a nice thing. If it's a discrete variable, it's the same thing. We basically just approximate this by an integral, and that's right. Use integrals to approximate some. Same story. I got one of these. I know. Obviously. There's no apostrophe. It took a long time to do that. I want you to understand how much time I put in for this class. Okay, so the cat's really important. So Zipf, let's talk about Zipf. So Zipf was an interesting character. Okay, he's good. Who was a linguist at Harvard, and he died only about age 50 in about 1950, and produced a number of very interesting books. And this was his magnum opus. It's a year before he passed away. You can buy a reprint now. It was impossible to find for a while. Or like Amazon, our friend Amazon would have 1 or 2 copies for sometimes $1,000. Anyway, it's reprinted, so you can get it. It remains an incredibly interesting thing to read through. It doesn't mean it's all correct or whatever, blah, 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 but wow. It's also, I think, increasingly clear as you look back at all of these efforts that the principle of least effort involves, in his own way, graduate students, right? So, an undergrad. So I'll have a quote for that at some point. Really worry about this. So I'll tell you more about that when it comes, at some point maybe, with chaos, with Ed Lorenz's work. Because he's the famous person, but there are other people involved. And my advisor actually found this out. So, okay, so he noticed these rank distributions. So we talked about a lot about power laws, but he had a different approach. It's a while ago, as I said, and he was just saying, all right, well, he was a linguist, and he was interested in how children learn. That was one part of it. I think he was an expert in Chinese. Funny guy. But word frequency was sort of the first part. And so looking at texts or how people speak or how children speak as they grow up, like which words do they use the most? How does their language expand? We've seen a couple of interesting power laws, right? There's the past tense thing, that was one. But also Heaps' law, I talked about how the number of distinct words grows as a text moves along. Anyway, this is the framing, human behavior. So this is the Homer Simpson, version of humanity. Probably not bad. But people, and he tries to have a mechanism, right? We're really interested in mechanisms. We want to understand why things are the way they are, and so he's certainly trying to do that. But it's just a little mushy, right? He'll talk about, people are not lazy, but they'll try to develop efficiencies in the way they behave, and it's sort of about time and work and effort. It's some funny thing in our heads. So we'll get to Zipf's law in a little bit. Other ways of getting to Zipf's law later, but let's just explain what they are. So we have a collection of entities. So it could be cities by size. It could be like how many times a word appears in a book, all sorts of things. Go to a forest, count up the species, count up the numbers of individuals in each species. There's a lot of ants to count, but you do it. And then you just have a big list. And it's really importantly, it's not just a list of numbers, it's a list of numbers with a name attached to each one, right? So there's Houston population, New York City population, and whatever it is. That can get a little lost. And when we get to this ridiculous thing called allotaxonometry, I'll show you how you can think about that. So we're just going to rank them, and you could rank them in different ways, but this is the kind of right ranking that we have for sport or music or winning, right? Number one is the best. And this is quite useful to have this ranking. You don't want to have 1,000 things and say 1,000 is the best, because then you could have more things and you'd have to change that. So this is good. So this is the biggest or whatever it is. Like I said, words in a text. And then Zipf made this observation that he sort of saw over and over, that the size, so this is a size, and I'll probably use S a bit more, is decaying as another power law thing. This is just rank. So in here, this is rank, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? It's decaying as some power. There are some, and we saw this for the Kahneman example, you get to a lot of equalities as you go right out into the tail of these things. So we'll do the right thing. You'll see different things being done, but we'll do the right thing, which is, let's say you're in the Olympics, and two people tie for first, right? So in the Olympics, you get each one gets a gold medal. There was that thing in the high jump, which was interesting. You both get a gold medal, and then bronze is bronze, right? So there isn't a shift up, right? So 3 is still 3. But what we'll do is say that the first ones are 1.5. Their rank is 1.5. You divide 1 and 2, add those ranks up, divide them by 2, and the rank is 1.5. So they're going to get half a gold and half a silver. There was in the warm-up for the triathlon in Tokyo the year before, the warm-up event, 2 English, Georgia Taylor Brown and Jess Lemeth. I think they won together, and they're friends, so they run over the line together. And then they were disqualified for not, trying. Yeah. It was a little rough. Lose some prize money. So it seemed all very lovely, and then they're like, no. This is further adrift, but there were years ago, right? I don't know if it was in the Rio. So I remember this. It was in badminton. There was a whole shenanigan where both teams were trying to lose. So like goose the which is like a Monty Python level of madness, right? Yeah. See who can stay the longest outside in Antarctica. And this competition is still going 80 years later. All right. I know I've talked about this, but this is a good Zipf's law example. This is a good physical sort of conception of it. This is from Nature. It's 2014. So this is what if you take the front page of every paper that had ever been written or was sort of recorded in the database and just stack them up, right? And they thought about what a normal piece of paper is. A4, of course, because they're English. And so this is the Eiffel Tower, and this is Mount Kilimanjaro, I think, up here. Yeah. Light aircraft cruising at 3,000. So, yeah, it's Mount Kilimanjaro. So that was the little thing to give you a visual, right? Right? I mean, we should have double-decker buses here as well, because that would also be, I'm joking. Like, but then you want to look into this, and so all of these papers here have had 0 citations. I mean, science is we're trying to produce knowledge. There's a lot of work goes into these. 0 biscuits, nothing, no votes, right? So that's pretty, but that's, as we've said, this is pretty common. If you have a floor of 1, like counts for words, right? You don't have words. If you take a book and count all its words up, you don't count up the words that don't appear. You can think about them. It's interesting. But everyone starts with 1 in that, right? But a paper can have 0. Still a paper, but it can have 0 counts. So that's up to here. This is 1 to 9. That's a huge portion as well. And that's why Google Scholar has that little upside down exclamation point 10 thing that they're pretty, it's like they give you a high five, right? If you get into this box. If you do it the right way, I suppose, right? Because there's always, you can subtract people's citations out of their own self-citations. That's another little, which does affect some people. And of course, because humans are humans, terrible things have happened with citations. There are editors of journals who've gotten into trouble because they forced everyone who wrote a paper for their journal to cite them. And yeah, it was harder, but they did it. Okay, and then this is 10 plus. And then this is the top, right up the top. Oh my God. There are ones that have 100 to 1,000 citations. There's only a million at that point. And that's this whole, that's this whole pile here. And I guess I sort of indicated it, but this is actually just the little top bit, right? And then the top 100 papers. And at that time, 300,000 citations, right? So that's, a lot. A lot, and it's protein measurement. How to measure proteins, right? So these are, and that's what you see of these. This is DNA sequencing. This is a lot of these are biology. I think they're all biology. This is density functional thermochemistry. I know you can't read it. That's lipids from animal tissue. Da, da, da. And there are some other statistics kind of things in here as well. But the top 100 about how methods for doing science. So the sort of, well, it's not bad, but I mean, if you want to facilitate science, right, of course, you build universities, you do all these things. But if you want to do it in a way you get lots of citations, then you make a paper and it has a big database or a big method that you need some luck, of course, that gets used. But they're the ones that, right? So they have Watson and Crick, right? That is, it's pretty high. It's up there, 5,000 citations. But we, like I showed you, Kahneman's thing. I mean, he has papers that are, it's 7 years later, but way beyond that, right? Einstein papers, they're there, but they're not at the top, not at the top. Okay, and there's the Hirsch index. This is Hirsch proposes an index to measure this and names it up, and it gets named after him. I don't know if he named it after himself. We'll talk about that. I have some nice stuff about that at some point. Okay. Oh, this is the discovery of the ozone hole, 1985, which I grew up in Australia, and you'd get sunburnt within about 10 minutes. You'd be burned to a crisp. It seems to have closed over, but it was a problem. We had hilarious ads about slip, slop, slap. Slip on a t-shirt, slop on some sunscreen, and slap on a hat, right? It was like little cartoons. Okay. Well, Australia's not a bad place to, we can take it. Okay. So here's the nice connection, which didn't, if you look at literature up until the 2000s, people just didn't seem to see this. They would measure Zipf's law and these frequency distributions separately. Just measure them and say, oh, we have a couple of things. I mean, obviously people knew this, but it wasn't sort of, I don't know. So this is a CCDF, right? This is the, right? So again, this is the simple example of this brown corpus. So this is the word the out here, right? This is the percentage of words that are a particular used, right? Frequency of use, turn into percentage, but it's frequency of use. And so, there's only the, and then there are of and so on, right? Coming back here. And this is the number of words that have been used at least some fraction, right? So it's the complementary cumulative. It's made this nice monotonic, clean thing. Okay, that's what we saw before. And then Zipf distribution, which is incredibly simple. We're not thinking about probabilities. It's very simple. We just take all the words that we have for this example, and then we just rank them, decreasing frequency of usage, right? So they're just ranked. So now this is on a log scale. So this is 1, right? This is sorry, this is 1 here. So this is the word the is here. Hard to see, but there's a the, that's the word the. It is the most used word, and that's its frequency of usage. So this is a really simple thing to make. And again, cities, biggest city, next biggest city, population. Very simple. And you just put them on a log plot because that exposes what they are, that they're power law things. So different spaces that they come from. This has got a lot more motivation in physics. There are lots of mechanisms that we can think about producing them. But of course, these are describing the same thing. And if you stand back and look at it, you can see that structure looks the same. So this seemed to be not, I mean, I'm not telling you, this is not, it's, okay, it's just, yeah, funny. So these things are related. And if you just flip that, let me try to do it. Like if you flip this one, these axes here, so we're going to put rank here and frequency of usage here, which is the same, right? This is the same quantity. So if you flip them, and we haven't rescaled anything, but you can see that they're following the same shape. So we should understand that, and that gives us a useful thing to go between. They're both helpful in the way we talk about things. I mean, the Zipf's law is very natural, right? It's a very natural thing to talk about. You want to talk about the most ranked thing, who has the most money, blah, blah, blah. And so we can play around with this a little bit. So if we have our probability distribution, this is this complementary cumulative. We're going to multiply by the total number of objects in the system. And then, so this will give us, this turns a probability back into a frequency, right? It's a number. So I'm just going to walk through it, but you have to think about it a little bit. So if you have some object, so this is a frequency of usage for a word, or let's say population for a city, then what this quantity tells you is how many cities have at least that population. And that's exactly its rank, right? Because that, if there are 30 cities that, I mean, it's plus or minus, plus 1 maybe, but let's say there are 29 cities that have a greater population, or 30 cities including itself, because we're doing it greater or equal to 30 cities, then that's also its rank. It's the 30th city in terms of size. So this immediately is connecting our Zipf thing. So we can say that the size, this is Zipf's law. This is Zipf's law. We're going to place that rank by this quantity which comes from the size frequency distribution. Just plop it in there. There's still a minus alpha on the outside. So all of this is rank. And we had this scaling, right? This is what we've said for the CCDF. If it does have a power law, then it's the size of the thing to minus gamma plus 1, right? So the underlying PDF has a minus gamma plus 1 for the CCDF. So we're going to put that into there. Got a minus alpha. So now we have x to the r is scaling like x to the r to this blob. And so there has to be, this is a power of 1. So 1 has to equal this blob. And then we can unwrap it. and we'll have alpha is 1 over gamma minus 1. So this is just a nice little connection between exponents. And in general, when you have scaling, and this is all through physics and lots of other systems, there are so-called, sort of an example, of scaling relations, right? There are, if you have different exponents, potentially there are these, the connections will be just simple algebraic fractions and plus and minus ones, right? Just simple combinations. So, yes. So for example, 2, right? 2 is this pretty deadly, it's a dangerous threshold. 2 is for gamma is where, right? So if we're going upwards, it's getting a bigger tail. When we hit 2, just as we go above it, now we have an infinite mean, right? So that's the case of alpha equals 1. 2 minus 1 is 1, 1 over 1. So Zipf thought everything was 1. He thought all of these things were 1, or that was the ideal. Well, it's not entirely true, but he thought a lot of these big systems like language, cities, had that. And they're close. They're not far away from it. And we'll get to an argument for why that is. So, right. So that's a good thing to understand, and you want to be able to see that this is working. If you measure, you can measure the exponent from one of these plots, and from the CCDF and from the Zipf distribution, and see that they should match up. All right. So that's valuable. Zipf distribution. I mean, it's everywhere. This is now 12 years ago, but looking at games of chess, right? So how many times a game path appears? Same kind of idea, right? Counting things again. And then it's another, I won't go on about it, but it's another Zipf's law story in chess. That's kind of weird, right? So why is that one there? What's the reasoning for that? This is one of these things that appears so much that people start to have ventured that it just appears for free and there's no deeper meaning, blah, blah, blah. It just comes out of randomness, and we'll see some of the fights between those things. So one of the big fights in terms of language is that it's framed in this way, which is random monkeys typing could produce these Zipf's laws, right? Yeah. We'll see that that's not great. Okay. Anyway, more Zipf's law stuff. If you like chess and these things, you can check that one out. So, okay, so that's a good place to stop for this, and I will show you a few more Zipf things from Zipf. But this is a deviation thing, so yes, I'm from Australia. So Don Bradman played in the 30s and 40s. They wrapped around the Second World War. And this will make no sense to anyone, maybe, but batting averages in cricket, in Test cricket, making a 50 is a big deal. You wave your bat. Making 100 is a very big deal. You make 200, 300, the highest score ever was a 400 by an individual. This could go for 15 hours, something like that. Right. It's a titanic thing. These days, these games go over 5 days. They're a proxy for war, like all sports are. Anyway, remarkable game, and it produces fantastic stories. So this is a histogram of batting averages. So these are the bowlers who are not good batsmen; they're terrible. But if you're in Test cricket averaging above 50, you're one of the greats. 40 is pretty good, but above 50, and there are 3 people historically who've batted enough and averaged over 60. But this is Bradman. It's 99.94. So he was just unbelievable. He was just extraordinary character, and there's been nothing close to that. So you have Michael Jordan or Gretzky. They're the best, but they're on the end of the tail. So he would go to England. If they got him out, that would be the front page. Would be he's out. Would be just the whole thing. So incredible folklore. He's from rural Australia, and lots of stuff about Bradman. But Bradman-esque is it's a term in Australia. Bradman-esque just means absolutely sublimely great. So this is sometimes we have these sort of things where there's something that pops off. I talked about the ridiculous Dragon King thing. That's not what this is. Okay. We'll talk about we'll talk about fame at the end of the course. Yes, we'll get to that. I don't know. I mean, there have definitely been records that have stood for a long time that have been anomalous. Some of them because, a lot of them because of doping, right? That's a real problem with that. I think his doping was to drink a tea which was half milk and full of sugar. Like, you literally have tea in these games. Um, I don't know. It's hard. Yeah, yeah. What'll happen is some players will have a spate in their career where they excel like that and they're just, but not for the whole career. Yeah. Not just cricket. I mean anything. Yeah.
I think it was Barry Bonds, like his best year when he was taking the steroids. Um, someone
When he hit 70, right?
yeah, what was it?
He hit 70 home runs or something.
Yeah, something insane. His batting average was like obviously highest of all time. So someone was wondering like, so they walked him. They should potentially walked him like almost every
Right.
pitch. So someone calculated for that year, like how does he rank historically if you took away his bat? And they like calculated like how he would have performed. He has the second best batting average of all time without a bat. He said that was just it.
The thing about Barry Bonds too was the little they say, oh yeah, he took steroids, but the eyes are a God-given. But this is not true. HGH helps your eyes as well. It helps the whole thing. It's unbelievable. Yeah. I know. People will still try to slide around and say, yeah, he took drugs. Everyone was.
Yeah, he was a whole like you can graph this and it's just insane.
Well, just a picture of him when he played for the Pirates when he was young is somewhat hysterically different to where he ended up. But the other thing is doping affects different people differentially. So Lance Armstrong, helped him a lot. The lying was really important there as well. But other athletes around him, helped them. But it doesn't always work the same way. It's not just like, oh, we're now on a new level playing field. Yeah, we're on a different playing field.
If you look at like the top 50 fastest 100 meter dash times in history, every single person other than these people has been caught.
Oh yeah. Well, and there was that same there was a matrix like that for Armstrong over time, which would be like, here are the top 10 for the Tour de France in these 7 years, and there's a big cross over all the ones that were dopers, and just nothing for Armstrong. And then he talks to Oprah, right? Yeah. If you've done something bad and you get to talk to Oprah, I guess, you've done something really bad. Yeah, it doesn't look good. The loophole for him is he's a funny shape. So maybe, but yeah, the doping is amazing. Also, it's expensive. Right? So the better ones have. That's also a differential for the playing field. So yeah, and you have to have like a zero guilt situation. All right, I'm gonna pile out a few of these, and maybe we'll present some more on Tuesday. But this is just a little extra bit just about Zipf. It's from that book that I mentioned. So, yeah, he was a linguist at Harvard, Chinese languages. And so he comes out of linguistics, but then he got excited about everything else. And as I said, it's this human behavior, principle of least effort, glottometrics. So this is a study of, So glossolalia is speaking in tongues, actually. Yeah. So yes, this is worth looking at because just you think about this in terms of now with the data that's possible and all that sort of stuff, just the framings that people, like so many of these old great papers. And of course, papers that are great, but we don't have them cited, so we don't get them. Anyway, so he wanted to treat this like natural phenomena, right? Which it's funny, it's coming from a linguist, but of course, 50 years later, all these physicists would pile in and say, I can explain everything. Now it's the computer scientists. Well, I can make everything with my machine. Yeah. So he's basically trying to turn this into a kind of a natural science thing like physics, and measurement is the big deal. And I mean, this is really important. And so here's his view, right? So people solving his intermediate, problems in front of him. Of course, it's him, right? The framing is not good, but a person doing so is going to try to, minimize there's going to be some attempt to optimize something, maybe. And it's going to be about total work. So he's trying to put it in this language of physics and a harder science. So average rate of work expenditure. I think we actually really minimize that sometimes. But he looked at these things, and I'll show you some graphs. So city sizes, I've said, but then all these other things like number of retail stores, number of services, people in particular occupations, trips between cities, how much stuff was moved between cities. So he's really trying to lift this into like, what is this big machine of society, if it is that? And how people, and then he has this one at the end, which is marriages versus distance. And so there was this quite beautiful result. It's not for everything, but it does seem to hold up somewhat, which is interactions between cities have kind of a gravity law, right? It could be framed in that way. So instead of mass of one object and mass of another, it's the populations, and then it's the distance between them. Instead of distance squared, because in 3D it's distance squared because we're talking about a surface area, and in 1D it's going to be a circle around a city. So he had a few of those. So it's gravity law. I'll just show you a few, and then maybe I'll save the others up. But this is the kind of thing back then, right? There are some. He definitely has plots, but there's also just lots of tables of numbers. Here's the rank, here's the frequency of a word, multiplying them together, and this is just some examples from Ulysses, which of course at the time was they had to count them, which I think is becoming clear. I just have sort of one insight into this, but also just all of science, that he didn't do this, right? He got his undergraduates to do this. But the observation from this is you sort of see this sort of feeling around trying to find this what sort of universal law, and this is one way to sort of show it, which is rank times frequency, and of course it's all in hundreds, so you've got a lot of hundreds here. They're pretty close to each other, and they're not varying enormously. So this would suggest that frequency the relative the usage frequency of a word decays like r to the -1, right? Put this over here, we've got 1 over r. So he made some of these plots. He's got James Joyce, he's got some other different data sets. This is the one in the middle is a pure -1 exponent. So if you're plotting this, you'd be like, okay, I think this is really something. It's a while ago, but managed to get pretty good, right? So 4 orders of magnitude. So he doesn't really have a mechanism for this, but he basically tries to say it's, and here I'll just put it out there, right? So he's speaking this fairly general terms, but he knows this is very uneven usage rate, and he sort of talks about it in this way. And I'll come back, I'll show you the graphs on Tuesday. But so you could have a tool for everything, right? You could do that. You could be a minimalist, like I was reading about Japanese ultra minimalism, where you have nothing in your room, just nothing. There's nothing in the room. There's just you. And people have at most in their life 50 things, right? There's those sort of movements. So 50 is the cap. So that's it's great for the listener, right? If every piece comes to you, you don't have to really you don't have to sort of think about context. Of course, we have this terrible mess where we have words that we reuse with different meanings, sometimes completely different meanings, and that's true of languages across the world. So that's a specialized tool for every task. And it's interesting to see which way we go with this, right? Because sometimes if you think about bicycles, to get back to bicycles, there was a while where you just have to have a special tool for every part of the thing. And now it's been more and more and more pushed down to having 2 Allen keys or 2 Allen wrenches. Because, you want people to be able to be flexible. So the decoding is simple, but encoding is hard. You have to really, work. On the other hand, you would have, it's up here. If you just had one word, ook, you just said ook, then it's easy for you to say it. You kind of know what's going on, but that's not going to work out. And then, so there's no real formal theory, but he's saying, well, it has to be somewhere in between it, right? This will be some sort of spread out thing. Maybe we'll have some tools which are used for a lot of things, and then we'll have some really rare ones that are special. But why it would be this nice scaling, why couldn't it be just two lumps? It's unclear. All right, so I'll show you these. I know it's time to go, but I'm going to show you a few more of these. But this is a weird one. This is the number of meanings of words as a function of rank. So it's decaying, right? These are the least used words out here, the most used words out here. And it's only for part of it, but the number of meanings is going down. This is a strange part of structure, and I have some data on it. Could be a good project. All right, place to stop. Office hours at 4. And yes, I think that's where we are. All right, thank you. Thank you.